Glad to have opportunity to be together and to study, to continue our study through the Sermon on the Mount. I made the comment the other day, I hope it's not, you don't consider it like we're bogging. I don't feel like we're bogging, though it's taking us a little while to get through it. But this section that we are in Matthew 5:21 through the end of that chapter is some of the heaviest of doctrinal teaching that has practical application anywhere in the Scripture. And I don't really apologize for us taking a little more time. As long as we feel like we are moving and covered, we don't want to be redundant. And yet at the same time, we don't want to skip over. This is the time in our going through the various tiers of the Bible story where we spend a little more time in detail. So we'll do that. But before we do that, we're in our Bible readings. We have come down we've come down to, today's the 30th, to Romans 11, 13 through 13, 14 through 16, then 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, and then today 5 through 8. So basically Romans 11 through 1 Corinthians 8. We talked about Romans Sunday morning a little bit. 9, 10, and 11 deal with the relation of the Jews and Gentiles and how God used them. And I think we mentioned in chapter 11 that he warned the Gentiles, though they had been grafted in, they could be cut off again by their what? Their what's that, Janet? Their disbelief, exactly right. And so when he concludes the 11th chapter, there's this boiling over of praise to God for his wisdom. And then in 12 through 16, he speaks of applications. I beseech you, therefore. Always remember, therefore is a type of a conclusion to what's been said all before. And really, the whole 11 chapters are a part of what he then styles as the mercies of God. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a what? Living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your spiritual, your reasonable service. And don't be conformed to the world, but be what? Transformed by and it starts with the what? With the mind, the renewing of our minds. And so in chapter 12, really 12 through part of 15, I think he deals with this idea of how we present our bodies. We use our gifts in verses 3 through 8 of chapter 12 toward members of the church, as we ought to. And then in 9 through 16, toward those who are without, including saints. But even verse 14, bless them that persecute you. We use our bodies as living sacrifices in doing what's right toward those who are without. And then he even includes whom in verses 17 through the 21. This really has reference to what we'll study in the sermon tonight. Our enemies, yeah. Render no man evil. Take thought for things honorable in the sight of all men. Avenge not yourselves. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. Verse 20. Then in 13, how to take care, how to exercise vengeance on evildoers is done by the civil government. And so then our responsibility to civil government, you could summarize in verse 1, let every soul be in what? Subjection to the civil government. And then in verses 8 through 10, really 8 through the end, our responsibilities toward neighbors, those who are without. And then in 14, there are two types of brethren mentioned in 14. I'll give you one. There you go. The weak and the strong. And the weak are not people who miss on Wednesday night. The weak are weak in respect to the fact that they think that I can't do things that God authorizes. I can't eat certain meats. I can't respect certain days. Others could do that. And so he deals with that in 14. And really the respect for one's conscience, others' consciences. Also, a big issue of chapter 14 is don't cause anybody to do what? To stumble. That's a huge principle that is mentioned. And that really continues on in through 15, about verse 7. And then Paul has some things concerning Jesus Christ, his mission to the Gentiles. And he talks about some of his traveling plans and how, and it really goes back, the bigger part of Romans, it goes back to the idea that the gospel that originated with, really God used the Jews to bring Jesus into the world, used the Jews through whom he would give his statutes and his types and shadows and all that. But the Gentiles actually were beneficiaries of all that. And so he's telling them, as he's making up this collection for the needy saints who were primarily Jews back in Jerusalem, that you Gentiles who are all in Asia and Macedonia and other places, you need to do this because in a sense you are debtors to the Jews back in Jerusalem, in the sense that it was through the Jews God worked out his scheme of redemption. 16 deals with salutations. Well, first of all, commendation of a particular lady, Phoebe. Oh, wouldn't it have been wonderful to have known Phoebe, a servant, a special servant in the church at Cenchrea, and she had just been such a help to Paul. She herself also had been a helper of many, and of mine own self. Oh, how much is stated in that little phrase, end of 2. This is mentioned that we learn a lot about in Acts in verse 3. Priscilla and Aquila. Prisca and Aquila are those. Then we have a number of other names that are mentioned in the greetings to Christians at Rome, and most of whom we just see here. And then sandwiched between the salutations or greetings to Christians at Rome and greetings from Christians where Paul is in 21 and through 24, there is this warning to mark them that cause divisions and occasions of stumbling and do what else to do? Turn what your translation is. 16, 17. To avoid them, yeah. Mark them, identify them, and avoid them. Those who are bent on trying to turn people from the faith, and he identifies who these are. And then salutations in 21 through 24, salutations from some who were at Corinth. And then in the end, at the end of the chapter, 25 through the end, there is this great benediction, this praise of God through the preaching of the gospel of Christ, the revelation of the mystery that he has been a part of. And all of this was according to the commandment of the eternal God, and it was intended to bring obedience of faith among all the nations, plural, into verse 26. Among all the nations, obedience of faith. All of it was brought. The gospel basically is preach the gospel to everyone. Every creature is for everybody. And then he closes. All right. And then briefly, 1 Corinthians made the point in talking about 1 Corinthians that it's primarily a people problem book. There is some discussion of false doctrine in the 15th chapter. There were some who doubted the resurrection, doubted the consequences of the resurrection of Jesus, did not understand some things. He dealt with that. But there were mostly people problems. And the first 4 chapters deal with divisions. Some and the whole book really deals with those people problems. And then Paul sets forth principles that deal with the problems, specific problems they have. Chapter 1, he deals with problems over preferences for on what, Brother Keith?
Some of them were Paul and some of them were of Apollos.
Exactly.
Some of Cephas.
Some of Christ. So people divided over various preachers. And Paul said, is Christ divided with Paul crucified for you? And he said, I'm thankful I didn't baptize many of you. Say Crispus, Gaius, a few others. And unless you have said I've been baptized in Paul's name. So he deals with the fact that the wisdom of God, that there's division over preachers. And he starts the idea there's division over wisdom, worldly wisdom. And God had chosen a wisdom, but the wisdom that God chose in which his revealed will was known was considered what by the world? Foolishness. And verse 21 is a great passage to memorize if you don't already have it down. For seeing that in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom knew not God, it was God's good pleasure through the foolishness of the preaching to save them that believe. So you have God's wisdom on one hand, by which we're saved, and the worldly wisdom on the other hand. And so in chapter 2, he goes on to say, he actually pits the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of men. And he said concerning his own himself, when I came to you, I didn't come with excellency of speech or worldly wisdom, proclaiming unto you the testimony of God. And the reason is he didn't want their faith to be in him or in worldly wisdom, but in the power of God. So he decided he would preach nothing but Jesus Christ and him what? Crucified. Right. Well, don't think that by my saying this that there's no wisdom to the gospel. In verse 8, we speak wisdom, however, among them that are full grown. And so the wisdom of God, the gospel is indeed wisdom. It is wisdom. But it's the kind of wisdom that nobody would have ever developed by his own senses. Things which, verse 9, quotation from the Old Testament, things which eye could not see, ear could not hear, which entered not into the heart of man, whatsoever things God wanted for those that love him. But unto us, the apostles, God revealed them through the Spirit. And so the wisdom that is from God had to come by special revelation. And so he still pits the wisdom of God on one hand had to be known only by special revelation, and it came to us, versus the wisdom of men that people were enamored by. And he ends that in chapter 2 by saying, look, by the fact that we have all of this through special revelation, the gospel's given, we can develop the mind of Christ. We have the mind of Christ. But he couldn't speak to them the way he wanted to because they were what? 3 verse 1. They were babes. They were carnal. They were still kind of crawling after some of their favorite preachers. And so he talks about the building up of the church and how there are different qualities of character and so he says any preacher who's preaching needs to make sure you are careful about how you build thereon. And then he talks about there's some that are like verse 12, gold, silver, costly stones. There are others that are like wood, hay, and stubble. And the fires of trial will tell you what kind they are. And so he deals with that. And the fact is, don't get all overtaken on all this, because if you divide the church, you're destroying the temple of God, verse 16. And don't you know the temple of God is holy? And God dwells in his temple. And you're trying to tear it down. And then in chapter 4, he says basically that the apostles and preachers are simply stewards. We're ministers. And that is basically it. However, I'm going to send Timothy to you, and when he comes, he will remind you of my ways which are in Christ Jesus, which I teach everywhere and in every church. That's a great passage, 4:17, which means that what he taught at Corinth was not located or just designed for Corinth, but what he taught there was the same thing he taught where? Everywhere else. And then in the, so we go through the 8th chapter, I'll speed up. 5th chapter, it deals with what? That's right, fornication. A man had his father's wife, likely a stepmother. And then he continues that he deals with withdrawing from those who were rebels and would not turn. And then the 6th chapter, how he kind of rolls this into the 6th chapter by saying in chapter 5 that, you need to be careful about those who are among you. Withdraw from those who are among you. God will take care of those who are without. Well, what they were doing, though, in chapter 6 is, if they had some legal problem, they were not trying to solve it within, but taking it where? To outside courts, yeah. And he says, don't you know, in a sense, you'll be judging the world and judging angels, and can't you find a wise man among you? Then he comes back, then he comes to, that you ought to know that these kinds of people, verse 9, the unrighteous, whether they be fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, or so, they're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. That's the way you were, but not anymore. And so don't bring your cases before a worldly kind of a court. Then he comes back to the idea of fornication that he left in chapter 5, and basically says that when you commit fornication, you sin against your own what? Your own body. It's a different sin in that sense. Not that one sin is worse than another, but it's a sin that involves the body, it involves the mind, it involves the intent. All of those things are, and so he says, flee, get away from it, run from it. And then he comes back to the idea that your body is special. It's a temple of what? The Holy Spirit, which is in you, and you're not your own. You were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. Don't give it over to sexual immorality and all that kind of stuff. Now, 1 through 6 looks like he deals with the idea of various problems that had been reported by the house of Chloe. In chapter 1, he says, it's been signified to you, my brethren, by them that are of the household of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. And I partly believe it. Then some say, and it looks like the first six chapters he deals with that. Then evidently, there had been a letter written to Paul, and there were a number of questions raised. And so he starts to answer those in chapter 7 and continues on. And the transitional word is that three-letter word, what? Now. And so you see now concerning the things whereof he wrote, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, sexually speaking, during the distress, and so on. So he talks about that in chapter 7. And then 8, now concerning things sacrificed to idols. And that really goes through chapter 10, 8, 9, and 10. And the point is, very similar to Romans 14, whatever you do, don't let your actions cause another brother to do what? To stumble. And even if you have to give up a certain right that you had, you can do that. Then 9 is sandwiched between 8 and 10. Chapter 9 deals with the idea that, look, I'll use myself as an example. Paul says, I gave up my right to receive what? What was that, David? Well, he had a right to receive, it deals with the money, the support for preaching the gospel. And he said, I had a right to do that, but I forewent that in your case, that I might not be a hindrance to some. And so he makes that point about himself in 9, then he comes back in 10 and says, look, you better be careful, because you can fall if you're not careful. And just like your Israelite brethren did. So let him that thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. And that's kind of how it ends. We'll have to stop on that. Spend a little bit more time, but it's just a great book to study, just like Romans is, when you put it all together. I so like, and I hope you do too, I so like the way that as we read, we get the bigger picture first. Because, as I've mentioned numerous times, I didn't really start out studying the Bible that way. I kind of emphasize here and there, look for a passage that would prove a point, and that's really not the way can teach truth, but to get it to get it as it's unrolled, just like we write a letter to. That's by far you keep things in context that way. Okay, now we're in Matthew 5, and. We want to go ahead and we'll spend more time on our review, so I won't do that now much on the life of Christ, except to say that we've had our study of the years of preparation, the beginning ministry primarily in Judea, and the great Galilean ministry the better part of 2 years. And he goes up there, miracles, some on the Sabbath day, healings on the Sabbath, and he calls the 12, and then somewhere right out here, right outside Capernaum, he's preaching the Sermon on the Mount. All right, real quick, the Beatitudes, and without going through all the details of them, the next 13 through 16, the similitudes, yes. You're the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Then the relation that he had to the law and what our relation should be. Good. 21 through 26. You've heard it said, don't murder versus don't be angry. And even reconcile. What was that? Without cause. That's right. And then reconcile as soon as you can. 27 through 30. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. Don't look to lust. And then 31 and 32, that's related, he said, it was said to them of old, if you divorce, give a writing of divorcement or a certificate of divorce and put it, then he tells what he says. Then in 30, that's 32. Then 33 through 37, where we were, you heard it said, thou shalt not swear falsely, but perform unto the Lord your oaths, but I say don't what? Don't swear at all. And then he gives the specifics, and it starts out, neither by heaven, it's the throne of God, by the earth, it's the footstool of his feet, or by the city, the great city, it's the great city of the king. What did he say? Nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the king, nor by your head, you can't make one hair, but let your yes be yes, and your no, any more than this is of the evil one. I'm not going, we talked Sunday morning about what oaths are, oaths in the Old Testament, some that were commanded. What Jesus evidently alluded to, if you want to keep in the back of your mind a great passage that showed that kind of juxtaposes where the Pharisees were and what Jesus is discussing, is Matthew 23, 16 through 22. That passage is the one that says, he just excoriates them because they were being so hypocritical. It's okay, you better keep your oath if you swear by the gold of the temple, but if you swear by the temple, what? Yeah, you don't have to, or the altar, but the sacrifice of the altar, then that's it. And so they were splitting hairs. That's a passage that I think Jesus was alluding, or the practice that Jesus alluded to. And then his answer was, don't swear at all. We talked a little bit about this. This is where we ended Sunday morning. The applications, always tell the truth, whether we be at work, we don't call in sick if we're not sick. We're at school, whether it be tests, homework, plagiarism, to our neighbors, church members. We talked, that's where we ended. Then keep our word and our promises that we make. When we say to her or to him and to him alone, so long as we both shall live, or somebody asks you, do you promise? And we say, I do, then we need to keep our word in that. When we pay bills, or we assume a bill, we assume a mortgage, we're going to pay it. What's the promises we make in songs? There are a lot of songs that are prayers, prayer hymns, that we're asking God to do something. Then in essence, we're covenanting to God, I'm going to do this. Angry words, oh, let them never from the tongue unbridled slip. I don't want to speak angry words. It's basically a prayer. God, help me with this. So we're making promises. And in our prayers, all worship. Okay. Yes, sir. Somebody say something? Yes, sir.
I was going to say, you said the Jews were splitting hairs. The Jews weren't splitting hairs, Philip. They weren't working on the application that God made. The Jews put themselves in the place of God, saying, this doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. God didn't say that. Yeah. They put themselves making law in God's place.
Yeah.
It's what they did. And that's, it's not, you hear the expression white lie. Yeah. In Revelation 20 says, all liars will have their place in the lake that burns with fire.
Right.
And so lying is not a white lie or a good lie or a helpful lie. Only in the mind of the person that's convinced themselves that so they can lie. Yeah. They don't have enough courage to tell the person the truth.
To tell the truth. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, well, splitting hairs, I use that to say, to try to make it look like, well, this is really important, but that's not. But you're right, all of it's important. When you just tell the truth.
What they said was unimportant.
Yes. And what they were doing.
You make void the
Word
law of God by your traditions.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right.
That is a hard statement against the hypocritical, lying Jews,
Yes.
Pharisees, and Sadducees that you have to be better than
Yes.
to be a Christian.
Yeah, and what they had done, and I think you mentioned that just a second ago, they had added to everything. I mean, all the Mishra, Talmud, all those were additions to get around, really. You know, and like you said, you made void the word of God, bought by your tradition and
The Pharisees weren't interested in making laws harder for themselves. They were interested in making it the way they wanted it.
Yeah.
And so when you say something that sounds hard to the world today, they say you're Pharisaical. No, that's not, you've been honest with what the Bible says.
Yes.
The Pharisees were trying to get out of doing
what God had
said.
originally said. That's exactly right.
They're the ones looking for a break.
Yes, that's exactly right. Look, some kind of a loophole. This would be an aside. And I would admit this would be kind of a side issue, but I think it's applicable. And that's, we don't want to make references to God's name in a careless, haphazard manner, but with reverence and awe. What Jesus pointed out when he said, well, if you swear by the heaven, but you don't actually use God's name, but you swear by heaven, well, it is his footstool. I mean, it's his throne, rather. If you swear by the earth, it's his footstool. And so, in essence, if you swear by any of these things, they're directly related to God. And so, you know, sometimes people will maybe take God's name or take a minced form of God's name, a euphemistic use of God's name, and use that. We don't want to do that. Not make references to God's name in careless. That goes back to the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Careless.
Philip, let me make one more statement about what I was talking about. The most important thing in all of that is how kind and merciful Jesus was talking to these people.
Mm-hmm.
He demonstrated that he was the one that could do these things,
Right.
in undeniable ways. And the harder they pushed on him, he got a little bit more firm.
Yeah.
And then in the end, you know,
Yeah.
he completely divorced himself from
Yeah,
them
dismissed them
because
yes.
they're not going to change.
Yes.
And you see the patience of God and of Jesus in that.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. You know, he mentions them once there in verse 20, but then mentions some things they were doing, and so you're going, you know, this. What I'm telling you is you got to be above this. Yeah, good point. Speech must be free from profanity. I think we did maybe mention this somewhere. Let's go on. The last thing, and I just alluded to, careless use of God's name or what is closely related to his name is to be avoided. We hear this a lot. My God, good Lord, 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 Lordy. I've heard that just even today. My heavens, derivatives of the word God also fall into the area. Gosh, golly, minced form of God often uses a mild oath. And Jesus says don't do any of that. Good gosh, good God, good by golly. All those, we sometimes I used to hear it, I don't hardly hear any of this now. People call them bywords. Remember that? Bywords and by God, by Lord, by, and it's a form of an oath. And usually to express exasperation with somebody or excitement, that kind of thing. So, in summary, keep in mind Jesus' primary point. Tell the truth. Just tell the truth. Related passages we mentioned, then don't swear. Comment, question? Anybody?
Can you imagine being a Jew then, or Gentile, that listening for all the years you've heard these Pharisees and Sadducees has been the one with authority.
Yes.
And now all of a sudden, here comes a man that says, no, I'm God's son.
Yeah.
And it's different now.
Yeah.
To me, that'd be hard to sit there and try to comprehend everything that he has said and And he keeps saying, this is the better,
Yeah.
and you got to realize it.
Yeah, yeah. You made me think about something too, Brother Charlie. So often, if you were talking about, this is completely, this is different from what they're used to. This is different from their family religion. This is different from everything. One reason why it was so difficult for some of these people to leave and follow Jesus, I'm reminded in John 12, you remember the case there that some of the Jews believed on Jesus, but they refused to confess him because of the Pharisees. Here it is, 12:41 and 42. Whoever has that first, read it.
Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. For they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God.
Yes, isn't that actually one of the reasons why a lot of people don't change religiously now? They don't want to be put in a boat they don't like, or don't want to be associated with somebody that's gone against, the established, the status quo, the established religion of their home life or their parents or whatever.
Or I got to change my way of life, and I told you what I was.
Yeah, and that's even bigger, isn't it? Yeah, that's exactly right.
In this woke society today, if you say homosexuality is a sin against man and God, and people who practice that are going to the devil.
Yeah.
They're lost in that if they don't change the way they live.
Yeah.
People go berserk.
Yeah.
You're worthy of death.
Yes.
Take your life, put you in prison.
And
put you in a mind, what do they call it? Re-education.
Yeah, sensitivity training.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. And it's getting to the point they want to mind control, that you don't even think of a thought that's not what the status quo is. And if you think a thought and you express it on some social media platform, then we'll cancel you. We'll cancel you out. Okay, all right. Comment, question, anybody else? A lot in this, yes ma'am.
I think it's interesting, thinking about what Charlie mentioned about the Gentiles and all. In our reading there in 1 Corinthians 26, but we have the mind of Christ.
Yes.
Then here we are, we're actually studying.
We're studying the mind, yes, exactly.
As he was when he was on the earth.
Exactly. It's his own teachings. And to study what he was telling disciples then to be, and then we see him as he actually was in his actions and how he actually lived what he preached. Then that gives us the example, it gives us the precept through the instructions. He gives us the motives, winning heaven, avoiding hell, the greatest blessings on earth. He gives us all of that in the life of Christ.
He never said, what do y'all think about this? It's always, I
say it to you. That's right.
It's not up to you to decide. I've decided. You just got to follow.
As he spoke and having authority.
Yes. He was the voice of authority. Yeah. Okay. And that's probably one reason they hated him. Yeah, he knew what he was talking about. Okay. Here we're back to where we were. I wanted to mention that in the next section, if you look at Matthew 5 with us, and the next section will be in verses 38 through 42. I think there is a pointed direction Jesus is going, from killing somebody you don't like in verses 21, adultery with somebody you want, not being honest with people, and now here's somebody who mistreats you, even physically. He says, don't retaliate. And then he ends it by saying, I even want you to do what to your enemies? I want you to love your enemies. And I can't help but think, I've used this chart before, but in Luke's account of these verses, I wanted to just really emphasize, read them together with me. But I say unto you, which hear, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, Bless them that curse you. Pray for them that despitefully use you. Now we learned that in Matthew's account back in the last beatitude. Blessed are those that are persecuted for righteousness' sake. But then according to Luke's account, he skips down to these verses that we're studying now. To him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer also the other. And from him that taketh away thy cloak, withhold not thy coat also. Give to everyone that asketh thee, and of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. And if you love them that love you, what thank had ye? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to them that do good to you, what thank have ye? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to them on whom you hope to receive, what thank have ye? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive again as much. But love your enemies. Same idea. Love your enemies. Do good to them that hate you. Love your enemies. Do them good. Lend, never despairing. And your reward shall be great. And ye shall be called sons of the Most High. For he is kind toward the unthankful and evil. Be ye merciful, even as your Father is merciful. That's in 5:48. Be ye perfect, even as your Heavenly Father is perfect. And in that case, it's love for enemies. That's the specific thing that he says here. But the point is that all of this has in mind that what guides me, and then Jesus shows the specifics as to how it should guide, is neighborly love. What is in the person's best interest? And we see that even here in 38 through 42. Sister Eleanor, would you read for us those verses, 5:38 through 42, please?
Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him too. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away.
This perhaps is some of the most involved of the sermon. And I have tried to boil it down by saying, don't retaliate. I think Romans 12, 17 through 21 is really a divine commentary on this passage. We'll get to that in just a moment. The related Old Testament scriptures, to start with, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And then Jesus says, but I'm telling you, don't resist him that is evil. Went on, and I've got a note on this a little bit later. That's not just carte blanche. Don't resist anyone. In a lot of senses, we're to resist the devil and he will flee from you, James 4 says. And there is a sense in which if somebody is saying something's wrong, we need to combat that. But it's not resisting with it's not returning evil for evil. That's the idea behind it. We'll get to that in a moment. But related to these passages that you may have in your marginal readings are at least three in the Old Testament. Exodus 21, Leviticus 24, and Deuteronomy 19. I'd like for us to look at these. We'll run out of time before we get too far. But I'd like for us to look at these because these are the passages Jesus had reference to that these Pharisees were using, I think, rather, and I've got this on the next paragraph. Look at this with me first, and then we'll read the passage. It looks like to me that these passages that we're turning to in the Old Testament reflected a misinterpretation of the Pharisees. The Mosaic Law never encouraged personal retaliation. In all of these passages that Jesus has reference to, there's not a one of them that says anything about if Brother Randy over here, hits me on one, I'm supposed to go out and do. There's not anyone that says that in so many words. It never encouraged that. It had never been God's law that if anyone lost an eye, to knock out the eye of his enemy or his tooth. Rather, it taught a restraining principle that would be applied by a judicial process. There was a type of a court among them. It involved priests as well as judges. And we'll see that especially in Deuteronomy 19. So the intent was not to sacrifice a second eye, but to spare both by causing one who was in anger to realize that any injury inflicted on his adversary would be in the end inflicted on himself. Basically, it was a deterrent to crime. And what the Pharisees had done was they twisted that in saying, look, I better think if I get angry at Brother Charlie or Brother Josh or somebody, and I just let them, now the courts can take care of this, and there will be a commensurate penalty on me. And so it was to restrain the evildoer. And it was not to be done personally. It looks like the Pharisees were taking that and saying, and basically, I've got authority. In fact, it's almost a positive. I can go out and exercise vengeance on my enemy personally. And that was done never even in the law. Let's look at these passages real quick. Exodus 21, 22 through 25. Brother Charlie, you have that for us?
It says, if man struggle with each other, strike a woman with child so that she give birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband made the man to him. He shall pay as the judge decides. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
Now, we've used this passage to show that even the unborn is considered what here? Human life. Exactly right. But I want you to notice the end of verse 22. The woman's husband shall lay upon him, and he shall pay as what determined? As the judges determined. So there was a judicial process. It was not personal retaliation. That's a passage that uses this eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so on. All right, let's go to the next one. Leviticus 24, 13 through 23. Leviticus 24. Lee, if you would read that 13 through the end of the chapter, 13 through 23. Well, would emphasize really, as I have it, especially verse 20, where that's really the passage that deals with it. But the point is that there's punishment that is commensurate with crimes that are dealt with. 24:13 through the end.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take outside the camp him who is cursed, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him.
Let me interrupt you there. Here's a person who hears another curse, but who is responsible for the execution of this fellow? The whole camp, okay? Go ahead.
Then you shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, whoever curses his God shall bear his sin, and whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death.
And who's to do it? Next phrase.
All the congregation shall certainly stone him, the stranger as well as him who is born in the land. When he blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death. Whoever kills a man shall surely be put to death. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, animal for animal. If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And as he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done to him. And whoever kills an animal shall restore it, but whoever kills a man shall be put to death. You shall have the same law for the stranger and for one of your own from your own country, for I am the Lord your God. Then Moses spoke to the children of Israel, and they took outside the camp him who he cursed, and stoned him with stones. So the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses.
All right, thank you. So you have a narrative mixed in with law. But the point made is that any kind of a penalty, whether it's personal injury or blasphemy against God or defamation of somebody's body, all of it was dealt with. There was a maximum punishment that could be inflicted, but it was to be done in a judicious manner. It was not to be done on any kind of a personal basis. And the last one, Deuteronomy 19, 15 and following. Deuteronomy 19, let's read that. I'll read this, because we're going to have to wind down in a hurry. Deuteronomy 19, he deals in the first 13 verses, 11, 12 verses, with the cities of refuge, which were for a man who had done actually what? What were cities of refuge for? Kill somebody how? Accidentally, that's right. But look at verse 11. If any man hate his neighbor and lie in wait for him and rise up against him and smite him mortally so that he dies and he flees into one of those cities, then the elders of his city shall send and fetch him thence and deliver him into the hand of the avenger of blood, that he may die. Thine eye shall not pity. You'll put away evil from Israel. Verse 14. Thou shalt not remove thy neighbor's landmark, which they of old time. And then 15. One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin, and any sin that he sins at the mouth of two witnesses or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall the matter be established. If any unrighteous witness rise up against any man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before the priest. Look at the arbitration here, before the priest and the judges. That shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition, and behold, if the witness be a false witness and have testified falsely against his brother, then shall you do unto him as he had thought to do unto his brother. So shalt thou put away the evil from the midst of thee. And those that remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil in the midst of thee. In other words, this should act as a deterrent to crime. Exactly right. And thine eye shall not pity. Life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So that idea of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, I wanted to really emphasize the context in which those passages are found. They're not dealing with personal retaliation, but something done is taken before their court system. So essentially what he says is these laws were the maximum that could be done and were to be done in a judicial process. Even in the case of murder, the avenger of blood became an officer in executing punishment of the murder. The defendant was not to execute the punishment personally. So what Jesus condemned was, evidently, the Pharisees took part of the law dealing with the maximum amount of retribution that could be taken on one guilty of some injury done, and that to be executed by judges and priests, and they turned that into personal right to exact vengeance on their adversaries. That's what I think Jesus is attacking here. And then he goes from here and he deepens the application of neighborly love. He moves from dealing with evil in ourselves earlier to evil in others, and from our withholding injuring the innocent, as earlier, to what love demands of us when others attempt to abuse and injure us. And keep in mind Luke's account of these verses. That smites you on one cheek, turn the other. You got physical injury. And then I'll say this, we got to go. You'll turn back real quickly to the sermon, Matthew 5. And you'll say this and then we'll have to stop. In Matthew 5, there looks like Jesus is dealing with various areas of injury. Eye for an eye and a tooth, but I say resist not him that is evil. This verse 39. Whoever smites you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. That's physical injury. And then if any man would go to law with you and take away your coat, let him have your cloak also. Here's legal injury. Verse 41. Whosoever would compel thee to go 1 mile, go with him 2. That'd be governmental injury. Then he ends it, give to him that asks thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn thou not away. That would be turning the negative to a positive and make basically financial benevolence to people. And I know there are a lot of questions we want to raise on that and try to answer. We're really out of time. But we'll try to do that on Lord's Day morning. But keep in mind Luke's account that what is dealing here is the idea of how can I best deal with these people. Physical violence, judicial injustice, governmental oppression, and then he turns it into financial benevolence. universal prohibition of retaliation, ending the prohibition by turning from the negative to the positive. We'll talk a little bit more about that again, Lord willing, on Sunday morning. Any comment, question? I hate to ask that because sure enough, there'll be something you no way you can answer in a minute. All right, we'll stop. Thank you for your